All right. This lecture is called Debating the Liberal International Order. And when you signed up for it, you signed up for the following description. Many scholars argue that China poses a threat to the liberal international order. Others disagree. But what is the liberal international order? Which is one question we'll be answering. And where did it come from? And why is this such a big part of debating about US policy toward China? What we're going to do is we're going to try to answer those questions, and we're going to try to provide you with some of the background knowledge that you need to debate arguments about the liberal international order with more sophistication and more depth than students typically do. And the reason I think this is particularly important is that while debates kind of about the liberal international order come up on all topics, insofar as there are impacts about hegemony and impacts about US economic leadership and soft power and things like that, this topic, it will be a much more central issue than on many of the previous topics that we have debated. And a lot of the debates about China's rise and whether China's rise will be peaceful or not hinge on understanding this concept of the liberal international order in more detail than I think most of you could probably explain at this point. So there are four parts of this. The first part is defining the liberal international order. The second part is a history of the liberal international order. The third part is an explanation of the key institutions of the liberal international order, and in particular what they do. And the fourth part is why the liberal international order is an important part of this year's topic. So Roman numeral number 1, defining the liberal international order. So depending on how much you know about IR theory, you have probably been exposed at least to the basic realist idea or theory that the international system is anarchic. Meaning that there's no authority that is higher than or above a nation state that can enforce behavior or rules or norms on nation states. And based on that beginning concept or that starting point, different theories of international relations arrive at different conclusions or have different takeaways from that insight. And the important one for our purposes in this lecture is the IR school of liberalism or liberal internationalism. And liberalism in this context is distinct from liberalism as it applies to domestic political things. So like liberals equals Democrats, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the IR theory of liberalism. And so if you want to read more, make sure that you're reading the right thing. So Dan Dresner, we quote him often in debate. He is a Tufts professor. He has a really interesting book that I'm going to do a lecture on later in camp about the application of IR theory to zombies, which I think provides a really interesting and cool introduction to how different theories think about international problems in the international system. But from that book, he has what I think is the best definition of liberalism. He says, and I'll quote from him rather extendedly, all liberals, despite the anarchy of international relations, share a common belief: cooperation is still possible in a world of anarchy. Liberals look at world politics as a non-zero-sum game. Mutual cooperation on issues ranging from international trade to nuclear non-proliferation to disease prevention can yield global public goods on a massive scale. These gains are not always distributed evenly, but they do make all actors better off than they would be in the absence of policy coordination. Major actors in world politics therefore have an incentive to realize the benefits that come from long-term mutual cooperation and avoid the costs that come from mutual defection. That's kind of the basic theory of liberalism. But Dresner continues, liberals do not believe that cooperative outcomes always happen in world politics. I think this is something the debaters get wrong. In some cases, preferences might be so divergent that no bargain can be struck among the actors. Even if a non-zero-sum bargain is possible, the incentive to realize these gains does not guarantee that collaboration takes place. The benefits generated by cooperation are often non-excludable, and that's an important word. In other words, anyone will benefit from broad-based cooperation even if they themselves do not cooperate. The conundrum for liberals is that while an outcome of mutual cooperation is better than one of mutual defection, all are best off in a situation in which they can unilaterally defect. Since every actor has these same incentives, the outcome can be a tragedy of the commons, everyone defecting, even though everyone is better off cooperating. So that's the basic theory of liberalism and kind of the problem with the theory of liberalism or the thing that liberals need to overcome in designing or architecting an international system. So liberals decided and believe that institutions have to be created that shape states' behaviors. So the liberal international order, the thing that we are talking about, at its most basic level, is a set of rule-based institutions and systems that bring order to the chaos of international relations. The two kinds of institutions that are created are political institutions and economic institutions, although the two terms sometimes collide. So there are many institutions that are both political and economic. I'll come back for questions in a minute. Let me get through the first part. Basically, you should think of the liberal international system as the closest that the world has to a world's government. There is no world's government, but there is a set of rule-based institutions that are as close as we have come to a world's government. John Ikenberry, is probably the most well-respected or leading scholar on this subject, and he offers the following definition, and I would try to write this definition down, or summarize this definition if you can't get it word for word. He defines it as an open, rule-based relations system, organized around expanding forms of institutionalized cooperation. So an open, rule-based relations system organized around expanding forms of institutionalized cooperation. We'll unpack that in a moment. In this sense, liberal international order can be contrasted with alternative logics of order, blocks, exclusive spheres, and closed geopolitical systems. So let's unpack that. An open means that it is an institutional framework that any nation can join, or at least any nation that is willing to abide by the rules. It is rule-based, meaning that there are rules that apply to all actors, and those rules are expected to be followed. It is organized around expanding institutional cooperation. So the goal of this open system, based on rules, is to maximize the number of countries that participate in institutional arrangements that foster cooperation, and to maximize the amount of issues on which these nations cooperate. The opposite, or the alternative that he describes, would be blocks. So that's like one set of countries cooperates, maybe based on a rule-based system, but it's not open. It's not open to everyone. Exclusive spheres. So that's where a certain country has exclusive control over a particular area, or exclusive control of a certain agenda or a certain set of policies. And closed geopolitical systems, where countries just don't cooperate, where there is no rule-based institutional system for nations to join, to work together and collaborate. The reason that this is such an interesting discussion is that the world has changed dramatically over the last 70 years because of the advent of what we now all take for granted, because of the advent of this liberal international order, this open, rule-based system that involves a lot of institutions and a lot of rules and norms for international conduct that the vast majority of countries comply with, even though there is no sovereign authority higher than them that's forcing them to do that, which is an interesting reality and one that intrigues international relations scholars. So I'm going to quote kind of at length from Ikenberry's book, one of Ikenberry's books, called Liberal Leviathan. And I want to explain what a Leviathan is, because I think that helps understand the function of the liberal international system from Ikenberry's perspective. So Leviathan is a biblical term for a sea monster. And the reason that Ikenberry uses it is that a philosopher named Thomas Hobbes, an English philosopher from the 17th century, used that term to describe the kind of sovereign government that people ought to agree to create if they are in a state of nature. So if they are in a system where there is no government, and they are in kind of the interpersonal equivalent of the anarchy of the international system. Most of you, I don't know if Hobbes is still studied, but most of you have learned about John Locke's social contract theory because it influenced the U.S. Constitution, so that's part of the U.S. history curriculum, the AP U.S. history curriculum. Hobbes is a variant of that, and he called for a much more powerful state, basically an absolute sovereign, and he suggested that because life is so bad when there is no government, when people are just out in a state of nature or in an anarchic state, life is solitary, poor, brutish, nasty, and short, is the quote that everyone always uses from Hobbes. We should voluntarily give up most of our rights in exchange for the protection of a Leviathan, kind of a sea monster type structure, monarchy, dictator that will protect us from each other. Ikenberry uses that concept of a Leviathan, or a sovereign, a controlling sovereign, to refer not to a specific nation state, but instead to a rule-based system of rules, norms, and institutions that acts in that same way. So essentially, because nation states, when they are just in the state of international nature, when they're in the anarchy of the international relations system without these types of rules and norms, because that's so bad, because life is so dangerous, because there's always the risk of conflict or conquest or invasion, because there is no guarantee that one's interests will be upheld, because you're constantly afraid of other nations, that these nation states, even though they don't have to, will be willing to give up some of their sovereignty for this higher authority, for this sovereign that is above the sovereignty of their nation state. And so Ikenberry, there's a quote from the book that I think this is from the book, it might be from an article, but he frames what I'm talking about today quite well. So I'm going to read this, and then we're going to transition to the history of this system. So he says, remarkably, we still live in the international order built by the United States and its allies over half a century ago. It is a distinctive type of order organized around, and I would list these things, open markets, multilateral institutions, cooperative security, alliance partnership, democratic solidarity, and United States hegemonic leadership. I'll read it again. Open markets, multilateral institutions, cooperative security, alliance partnership, democratic solidarity, and United States hegemonic leadership. It is an order anchored in large-scale institutions, which include the United Nations, NATO, the Bretton Woods Institutions, the World Trade Organization, alliance partnerships between the US and Asian partners, and informal governance groupings such as the G7/G8. In the background, the United States played a hegemonic role providing public goods by supporting open markets and the provisioning of security. And I could share that card with you, or if you just search for a few of those words, you'll find this listing from Ikenberry in several places. But here's why this is such an interesting topic for debate. This American-led international order, Ikenberry writes, was a very specific type of liberal order. It was a liberal hegemonic order. The United States did not just encourage an open and rule-based order, it gradually became its hegemonic organizer and manager. The American political system and its alliances, technology, currency, and markets became fused to the wider liberal order. In the shadow of the Cold War, the United States became the owner and operator of the liberal capitalist political system. The United States supported the rules and institutions of liberal internationalism, but it was also given special rights and privileges. It organized and led an extended political system built around multilateral institutions, alliances, strategic partners, and client states. It was an order infused with strategic understandings and hegemonic bargains. The United States provided services to other states through the provision of security and its commitment to stability and open markets. In these ways, the United States was more than just a powerful country that dominated the global system. It created a political order, a hierarchical order with liberal characteristics. And that's why this is such an interesting topic to study, because what the United States has created, along with its partners, but mostly what the United States has created in the last 70 years, has totally shaped the international environment in which all states now operate. And this is somewhat unprecedented in the history of the world. There is this whole apparatus that we all take for granted and that you all have grown up in without ever really thinking about it. The WTO exists, the UN exists, the IMF exists, the World Bank exists, the G7 exists, the G20 exists, and there are all these kind of norms of international behavior. There are all these rule-based institutions, and the United States exerts massive control over almost all of them. And as a result, there is an interesting now dilemma as rising powers like China have to decide whether to incorporate themselves within this liberal international order, perhaps to reform it slightly or to gain some power within it, or instead to challenge its very existence on the basis that this is a liberal order created by the United States to serve the interests of the United States, and instead they would like to seek an international order built around their interests, their values, and their leadership. And that fundamental dilemma undergirds a lot of the impacts that you will discuss in debate, from hegemony to soft power to global economic leadership, multilateral free trade, and China's rise and whether it's peaceful or not. So Roman numeral 2 is the history of the liberal international order. And I think this is important to understand. I'm going to kind of go through this relatively quickly, but there are a lot of kind of little things that I want you to understand from each section of the history of the liberal international order. Almost all of this is adapted from a chapter in a book that Dresner wrote called Is There an Exceptional American Approach to Global Economic Governance? And he divides kind of the history of the modern world. Once nations started being able to trade with one another internationally, he divides it into 5 eras. And so I'm going to go era by era. I'm going to kind of describe that era to you. And what I want you to pay attention to is how kind of what we know today as the liberal international order kind of came from nothing and how it has evolved over the course of 70 years. And then think about what the what China might think about that, or what Russia might think about that, or what Brazil might think about that, or what India might think about that. Because I think understanding this history helps to understand the debate over China's rise in particular, but the larger question of whether the BRICS are going to incorporate themselves into the liberal international order or not. So the first era is 1860 to 1914, and it's called the First Era of Globalization. And this is kind of pre any of this. So basically the first time there was any economic treaty was 1860, and it's called the Cobden, I don't know how to pronounce this, Chevalier Treaty. I'm sure someone who's taken a history class will laugh at me because I don't know how to pronounce this. But it's a treaty between France and Germany that's just like a trade agreement, basically. A treaty regarding trade between the two countries. And it was the starting point for global economic governance. At this point, by about 1880, there was a gold standard led by Britain, and that's kind of how the world's global monetary norms went. There was a thing in 1883 called the Paris Convention, and in 1886 called the Berne Convention. Those started to establish intellectual property rights. That was the first time that was a thing. And during this era, this was kind of the beginning of free trade, there was generally a move toward open trade, but there was a huge exception, and that was that all of the colonial powers closely guarded their colonies. So they wouldn't allow other countries to kind of utilize the benefits of the colonized countries. So Britain's colonies, they kept all of the stuff they took from their British colonies and kept it for themselves. They didn't allow France to go exploit the colonies. But at this time, the US was not a major economic player at all. The United States was basically protectionist for the entire 19th century. They didn't have any trade agreements, and they didn't take part in these European intellectual property agreements. The next era is 1919 to 1939, and that's the interwar era. And this is when the first significant multilateral institutions were created. So prior to this era, this isn't that long ago, there were no multilateral institutions. The idea of a multilateral institution didn't exist. So the first ones were the League of Nations, the International Labor Organization, and the Bank of International Settlements. And in principle, the central banks of the major European economies cooperated. But in practice, there was a lot of economic closure still. It was not a kind of environment of open free trade and trade liberalization. And then the Great Depression happened, and it really put a dagger into a lot of the burgeoning international trade and financial cooperation, because there was, then that ushered in World War II. The US refused to join the League of Nations, something I'm sure you've studied in AP US history, and refused to cooperate during the Great Depression on any exchange rate stabilization program with other countries. And then in 1921, the United States passed a huge tariff on agriculture. And then in 1930, they passed the Smoot-Hawley Act, which is the one that you probably have learned in school, and that raised US tariffs on about 20,000 imported goods to record levels and basically led to a total shutdown in international trade. There's a debate about how much that contributed to the Great Depression, but the common sentiment is that that played at least some role, although recently there's been some kind of historical revisionism about that. In 1934, there was an important development in light of all of that. So Congress kind of really screwed up the Great Depression, and there was a move to try to fix that. There was something called the Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act that passed, and it gave negotiating authority for these kinds of trade agreements, and it moved it from Congress to the executive. So this is the first time that the president was able to negotiate trade deals with other countries, and in the next 5 years, the US negotiated 22 trade deals. So that was the beginning of the United States starting to participate more in global trade. The next era is 1945 to 1971, and this is where it starts to get important for our debates today. This is called the Bretton Woods Era. The US and other world leaders tried to make up for or fix the conditions that caused the Great Depression. And so within 3 years of 1945, the UN, IMF, World Bank, and GATT were created. GATT is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And that's the organization. It's not really an organization. That's the set of rules, an agreement that regulated international trade that was the predecessor to the World Trade Organization. And I'll talk about what's different between GATT and the WTO when I get to that section. According to the preamble of GATT, and this was very important, its purpose was the substantial reduction of tariffs and other trade barriers and the elimination of preferences on a reciprocal and mutually advantageous basis. So the goal was to make sure that all countries could benefit from trade and that all countries would eliminate barriers to trade, because while each individual country might have an incentive to protect their industries, if all of the countries do that, everyone is worse off. So this is a classic liberal internationalist dilemma, as described by Dresner in the introduction, and the solution was to kind of get every country to agree to this multilateral GATT agreement. the Bretton Woods institutions or the Bretton Woods system will come up in cards all the time. And you need to know what that means, because I think even though we read cards that say Bretton Woods in them all the time, I bet if I asked 95 or 99% of debaters, hey, what's the Bretton Woods institutions, they would say ... question mark. So the Bretton Woods system is a system of monetary management that was negotiated by the United States, Canada, Europe, Japan, and Australia during World War II. The reason it's called Bretton Woods is that there was a conference called the Bretton Woods Conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944. And this conference set up the International Monetary Fund and something that is now part of the World Bank, but at the time was called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So IMF and World Bank were created by Western powers plus Japan. And I guess Japan can kind of be considered a Western power even though it's not in the West. But the US, Canada, Europe, Japan, and Australia were the countries that made this. And the United States insisted that the Bretton Woods system, the IMF and this precursor to the World Bank, be based on gold and the US dollar. We're going to talk about the gold standard and the US dollar, but at that point there was a gold standard on the US dollar. And so as a result of that, the Soviet Union did not agree to join. So the Soviet Union did not join the IMF and World Bank. They didn't sign on to the Bretton Woods Agreement. Ikenberry's argument is that this was the beginning of when the US engaged in what he calls self-binding, which means demonstrating its credible commitment to international institutions by playing along, basically. By agreeing to, even though they were powerful, agreeing to abide by these rules so that these institutions would achieve greater credibility in the international system, which then could convince other nations to join as well. But even though the United States did that, it often acted outside of these multilateral institutions in the immediate wake of their creation in order to save them, or because the United States didn't think that they would be effective. So for example, the United States played a big role in restoring the economies of Europe and Japan after World War II, and in doing so they acted outside of the International Monetary Fund. So the Marshall Plan, for example, was a unilateral US-led policy that acted outside of the IMF, even though the United States had just created the IMF for the purpose of doing things like the Marshall Plan. That's important because that trend continues, and that's something that critics of the liberal international order from China will talk about, and I think it helps to understand their arguments. The US had a combination at this time of unilateral policies. Sometimes they do unilateral things, multilateral policies. Sometimes they go through a multilateral institution, and what Dresner calls multilateral approaches, where the United States used multiple multilateral institutions at the same time to accomplish the same end. In the 1960s, the US created the G10 and the OECD's Working Party 3. Those were sort of ad hoc groups or clubs, as they are often referred, of rich countries. And the United States did that to avoid using the IMF because it was difficult to use the IMF. There were a lot more players involved, and because they were really trying to save the gold standard and save the United States dollar's prominent role as reserve currency for these international institutions. But in 1971, a really important thing happened that has shaped the rest of all of this, which is that President Nixon decided to stop the gold standard. I assume you learned about that in school, but that violated the IMF's Articles of Agreement. So part of the IMF's Articles of Agreement was that the world would operate on the US dollar backed by gold, but the United States, without going through the IMF process, just violated the IMF's Articles of Agreement by ending the gold standard. And President Nixon placed a 10% surcharge on all imports, which was a direct violation of the GATT agreement. So in the 40s, the United States created these institutions. Throughout the 50s and into the 60s, the United States sort of supported these institutions, but also acted outside them when it was in the United States' best interest. And then in 1971, the United States basically explicitly violated both the IMF and the GATT. And at the time, there was a major crisis of confidence. So the next era is 1971 to 1991, and that's referred to as the post-Bretton Woods era. There was an oil crisis in the early 1970s. So 71, Nixon ends the gold standard, does the surcharge, so violates GATT and the IMF. 1973, there's an oil crisis. And so this was one of the first crises of American hegemony. At the time, there would have been articles written, if we were at a debate camp, like, is this the end of American hegemony? Is this the end of America as a global superpower? Is America collapsing? But somehow, the global economic governing system survived and adapted to this dramatic injury to the United States and the United States' violation of these protocols rules. So GATT continued to make progress, trying to establish trade rules. The IMF started providing loans to developing countries. Before that, it just managed exchange rates for developed countries, for rich countries. It got into providing loans to developing countries around that time. And third world countries kind of mounted a challenge to these institutions because they didn't have any control over those institutions. A lot of times those institutions were enacting policies that they disagreed with. They proposed something called a New International Economic Order, or NIEO, which is something you'll find referenced in the China Rise literature a lot about the contemporary debates about the rise of the BRICS. But the United States and its allies defeated this and maintained the liberal international institutions. This is also the era when the phrase fair trade, which you still hear about now in domestic political debates in the United States, began to be prominent in the United States, kind of challenging the free trade, the existence of free trade, or kind of the undying free trade, or unending, unlimited free trade. Presidents Carter and Reagan both took actions to protect U.S. industries, kind of adopted protectionist measures. The steel industry received protection, the automobile industry received a lot of protection. And the United States started to take unilateral actions to force other countries to follow it, meaning the United States' trading rules, not necessarily the GATT trading rules. And that is what eventually resulted in the creation of the WTO in 1995, and I'll talk about that more in a second. This is also the time when the United States created an organization called the G7, another kind of club of clubs, where the world's leading countries, the world's leading economies could get together and kind of formulate policies outside of the existing institutional framework. So international institutions continue to proliferate throughout this era. From Bretton Woods to post-Bretton Woods, there's a huge kind of challenge in credibility for these institutions, but somehow they survive, and the United States continues to play a role in shaping them. But the whole time, the United States is also operating outside of them. So the last era is 1991 to 2008, and that's what's called the Washington Consensus era. And the reason that this is the time when the reason that the break is 1991 is because at the end of the Cold War, the United States all of a sudden found itself as the world's only superpower and basically unchallenged in the international system. And so the United States pushed a set of policies called the Washington Consensus. And you need to understand this because there is a huge debate between the Washington Consensus and the Beijing Consensus in the literature. And the Washington Consensus involved kind of four basic things. So you'll find different definitions, but I think this is probably the best one. Trade liberalization, meaning free trade and the elimination of barriers to trade. Prudential macroeconomic policies, which means cutting down debt and being kind of fiscally responsible. Deregulation, getting rid of regulations. And privatization, which means transferring government powers to the private sector. And in 1995, GATT, which was just a set of rules agreed to by nations, became the WTO, which is an organization dedicated to creating rules for trade. So GATT was just a treaty, like an agreement. The WTO is an institution in which nations are members, and then that institution creates many trade policies. So GATT itself was only about the trade of products, but the WTO took over responsibility for regulating services as well, and it took over for regulating intellectual property rights, and it sort of took over for managing disputes of trade. During the same time as the WTO was expanding, other countries became members. China became a member of the WTO in 2001. That's important. The IMF and the World Bank were also expanding during this time. And the important thing to know is that the United States, because of the fall of the Soviet Union, had enormous influence over these organizations. And it used those institutions to push its foreign policy agenda, to push the Washington Consensus. It did that in places like Latin America, East Asia, the former USSR, Russia, kind of rebuilding Soviet states, and Turkey, which meant that protectionism worldwide declined, and the United States was mostly able to avoid adopting any protectionist measures. As time went on, other countries started to be concerned about how much control the United States had over those institutions. The George W. Bush administration in the very early 2000s pushed through some changes in voting procedures, especially at the IMF, that gave more power to China and to some of the other countries because they were concerned that these countries were going to abandon these institutions if they didn't feel that they had some ownership or some control over those institutions. But the United States, while it was supporting these multilateral institutions and shaping them and kind of encouraging them, really just fiating them to take certain policies, they were also forum shopping between multilateral institutions to kind of find the best one to get a particular agenda passed. And that led to lots of new bilateral trade agreements between the United States and other countries. So we kind of, instead of going through the WTO, instead of contributing to new fully multilateral trade agreements, we started to just do some bilateral ones. So we had one with Australia, Singapore, Morocco, Peru, Central America. And the point was that the United States thought that even if the WTO process slows or fails or can't reach agreements, the United States can cement its preferences through these bilateral trade agreements because it has such a major, it has such economic power, it's such a major economic player, and the Soviet Union is gone, so there's no competitors. At the same time, the US created something called the Financial Stability Forum, which was basically a replacement for some of these economic institutions that was tilted toward the G7, which is controlled by the United States. And the IMF during this era lost a ton of credibility. This was kind of the era of a crisis of the IMF. The IMF had been pushing this Washington Consensus stuff on third world countries that was having devastating effects on a lot of them, Latin America, Africa, East Asia, and those countries really didn't have any say in those IMF policies, and so the IMF lost a lot of credibility during that era. So there's a debate, historically now, as we've reached the modern day, between the Washington Consensus, which I have described, and the Beijing Consensus. These are competing theories for how the international economic system should run and how developing countries ought to grow into developed countries. So there are many people who write about this, but there's a person at the Peterson Institute named John Williamson who coined these terms in 1989, and he's written more about it recently. I'll list the 10 things that kind of go into the Washington Consensus. I've already kind of talked about a lot of these. You don't probably need to write all of these down, but just kind of as I'm saying these, kind of get a sense of what this vision for the world looks like, what this vision for the global economy looks like. So number one is fiscal policy discipline with avoidance of large fiscal deficits relative to GDP. Number two is redirection of public spending from subsidies toward broad-based provision of key pro-growth, pro-poor services like primary education, primary health care, and infrastructure. Number three is tax reform, broadening the tax base and adopting moderate marginal tax rates. Number four is interest rates that are market determined and positive in real terms. Number five is competitive exchange rates. Number six is trade liberalization, which means liberalization of imports, with particular emphasis on elimination of quantitative restrictions like licensing, any trade protection to be provided by low and relatively uniform tariffs. Number seven is liberalization of inward foreign direct investment, the BITAF. Number eight is privatization of state enterprises. Number nine is deregulation, which is what you think it means, abolition of regulations, maybe with some exceptions about safety and the environment and consumer protection. And number 10 is legal security for property rights. And now think about the United States' clash with China and kind of major disagreements with China, even just with what you've learned so far regarding the bilateral investment treaty. A lot of them are on that list. In contrast, Williamson says that the Beijing Consensus has kind of 5 major tenets. And this one is a little bit more debatable, and there's a lot of scholarly literature that goes back and forth on what it means, what the Beijing Consensus includes and what it means. So number one is incremental reform, as opposed to major economic restructuring. So the IMF Washington Consensus proposal involved a lot of structural adjustment, a lot of kind of massive changes in developing countries' economies. The Beijing Consensus is let's just do incremental reform. Let's not totally restructure economies. Number two is innovation and experimentation. This means there is not just this one IMF blueprint for all developing countries to follow. We should have to try different things. We should experiment. Each country might try this, and if it works, do something else. Not just one IMF model. Number three is export-led growth. China pursued export-led growth. That's how it was able to drive the growth of its economy, and so its model is that countries should seek, in order to go from developing to develop, they should seek to expand export-led growth. That's something that the United States Washington Consensus doesn't include at all. Number four is state capitalism. So China has never said we're not communist anymore, but they really don't have any central planning anymore. The thing that differentiates them from American capitalism is just that so much of the economy is a state-owned enterprise, an SOE, and those state-owned enterprises receive benefits from the government. So it's capitalism, but there are particular companies that receive extra benefits to hopefully benefit their economy. And they basically agree with the free market, but they think the state should play a bigger role in creating state-owned enterprises that use the free market to get rich and to make more money sooner so that countries can become developed more quickly. And number five, the last one, is authoritarianism. And the argument that China makes is that democracy slows down growth, and democracy results in disinterested policymaking that takes its eye off the growth ball, and it stops countries from progressing as quickly as possible from developing country into developed country. And so a hallmark, as a result of this, of Chinese foreign policy has been to respect sovereignty basically at all costs. And this might be changing during the Xi presidency, as maybe that's not going to be Chinese doctrine going forward. But as China has developed, kind of the Beijing consensus idea was that no matter what, country's sovereignty should be respected because it is a country's sovereignty, it's a country's control of its people and its economy that will enable developing countries to succeed and become developed countries. So that's kind of the history of the liberal international order, and hopefully from that you can kind of see why there might be disagreement between the United States and China, why there might be costs and benefits, advantages and disadvantages of the liberal international system that the United States has created. I'll talk about some more of those arguments at the end, but section 3, Roman numeral 3, is the key institutions of the liberal international order and what they do. And I think hopefully now you can list a bunch of the institutions that make up the liberal international order. And some of this might seem obvious, but I don't think it actually is, and I think a lot of debaters actually don't know what organizations like the IMF and the WTO do. So I'm going to tell you what they do, and I think this is a lot of information that helps you understand the research that you do and the cards that you have to read, whether you're cutting the cards or just reading cards that other people have cut, but it also really helps in cross-sects and in explaining the liberal international order related arguments. So the first major institution is the United Nations. The United Nations, I think we all have a basic understanding of, so I'm going to talk the least about it. There are 193 member states, and it's divided into 6 parts. So there's the General Assembly, which is like the main legislative body. There's the Security Council, which is a specialized subgroup of that decides important resolutions related to security, like war and peace kind of stuff. There's the Economic and Social Council, which promotes economic and social cooperation and development. There's the Secretariat, which is like the study section, like the Congressional Research Service sort of the UN. There's the International Court of Justice, which is the court of the United Nations. And there's something that isn't active anymore called the Trusteeship Council, which oversaw trust states and kind of helped them achieve their independence. The UN system also includes the World Bank Group, the World Health Organization, the World Food Program, UNESCO, which is the Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, and UNICEF, which is the UN Children's Emergency Fund. And this is a giant apparatus with tons and tons of bureaucracy it sort of is the closest thing we have to a world government. That's part of the liberal international order because the United States contributed to the development of the United Nations, and the United States plays a disproportionate controlling role within the United Nations. Number 2 is the World Trade Organization. I kind of described this already, but it's an international, intergovernmental organization that regulates international trade. And I thought that the WTO website had a rather well-written explanation of the different things that the WTO does. And I think that debaters don't totally understand this, so I'll go into a little bit more depth about this. So the WTO says that there are a number of ways of looking at it. It's an organization for liberalizing trade. It's a forum for governments to negotiate trade agreements. It's a place for them to settle trade disputes. And it operates a system of trade rules. But as they say, it's not Superman, just in case anyone thought it could solve or cause all of the world's problems. So I'm not sure who wrote this, but it's rather weird. So it says, above all, it's a negotiating forum, which means that the WTO is where member states go to sort out trade problems, and they talk to each other, they negotiate, they try to get an amendment to the GATT and to the other agreements that are still a part of the WTO's portfolio of rules, and then they try to get nations to abide by those rules. And the previous set of negotiations in 1986 to 94 was the Uruguay round, and now the Doha round is still continuing. And so when you see references to the Doha round, that just means that's the next set of negotiations over how to change and adapt and grow and alter and continue to develop the trade rules within the WTO. Negotiations primarily are about reducing barriers to trade, and they are about resolving differences of opinion about what the trading rules for the international system should be. It's very hard to negotiate multilateral trade rules because obviously all countries have different perspectives, they have different interests, and it's hard to hash out a universal set of trading rules. This is, like we said in the introduction, one of those classic dilemmas of liberal internationalism. It would be in the best interest of all countries to follow the trading rules, but it's in the best interest of any particular country for there to be an international set of trading rules and for them to be the only defector. So there is this possible tragedy of the common situation. That's the primary purpose of the WTO. It's also the set of rules itself is called the WTO. So those are the agreements that are negotiated and then signed and adhered to by the countries around the world. It's also a place where disputes are settled. So it's the place where when two countries have conflicting interests or they have arguments about whether one country is violating WTO rules, they take it to the WTO and they try to settle those differences through a dispute resolution mechanism that they have agreed to, that is neutral and that provides them with a sense of justice so that they do not resort to tit-for-tat trade wars or for actual military conflict to protect their interests. Institution number 3 is the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. And its purpose is to maintain the stability of the international monetary system. So exchange rates between countries, that's an important purpose. And international payments, so payments from one country to another, are the kind of primary things that the IMF is supposed to regulate. And then in 2012, its mandate was updated or expanded to include all macroeconomic and financial sector issues that bear on global stability. So after the Great Recession of 2008, the IMF's role is now basically take care of all macroeconomic and financial sector issues that might threaten to collapse the global economy, or not even necessarily collapse it, but that could devastate the global economy, hurt the global economy. The IMF's fundamental mission, according to their website, is to ensure the stability of the international monetary system, and it uses 3 things. It does 3 things to do this. It keeps track of the global economy and the economies of all of the member countries. It lends to countries with balance of payment difficulties. So countries that are broke, it gives them a loan. And it gives practical help to members. So that first part is called surveillance. And it monitors the economic and financial policies of its 189 member countries. So that is both globally, it kind of assesses global trade, it assesses how the global economy is doing, and it assesses each individual country's economy, trade, etc. And it highlights those countries which might be a threat to stability, and it advises those countries on policy adjustments that they could make. So the IMF sees that Greece's economy is not doing well. They give Greece information about that. Like, hey, Greece, your economy's not doing well. Greece says, we know our economy's not doing well. What can we do? The IMF says, here is a set of policies that you ought to enact. And the goal is for this international institution to be able to step in and help economies. And the reason that it's an international multilateral institution is that maybe Greece wouldn't want the United States to tell Greece what to do, but because the IMF is supposed to be a multilateral institution, all 189 countries' interests are being protected, all 189 countries care about the global economy, and so the nation, in this example Greece, is more likely to accept that advice. It doesn't always work out like that, but that's the idea. The lending part is a core responsibility of the IMF, and when countries have actual or potential future problems with their economy, the IMF can offer them loans to fix balance of payments problems. It can help them build their international reserves. It can help them stabilize their currencies. It can help them continue paying for imports, which it needs. It can just, basically the idea is to help restore the economy so economic growth can continue. And those loans are often accompanied by provisions that say, all right, we'll give you a loan, but you have to make this adjustment to your economy. We'll give you a loan, but you got to make this change in policy. It does not lend for specific projects like a development bank does. It only lends for kind of overall economic growth concerns. And then the last aspect is called technical assistance. That's what I was describing. They just kind of, they have experts, economists, they produce policy recommendations, they produce data sets and information, predictions, projections, that kind of thing. And they try to train countries to fix their economies when their economies are struggling. Institution number 4 is the World Bank, which is an international financial institution that provides loans to developing countries for capital programs. The IMF and the World Bank are not the same thing, and they're not the same thing as the WTO. The World Bank, there's 5 organizations within the World Bank, but there's really just 2 major parts that you need to know about. There's what's called the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, or IBRD, and that lends to governments of middle income and credit-worthy low-income countries. So these are kind of the middle developing countries or the lower developed countries and the credit-worthy developing countries. That's kind of the idea. It gives them loans so that they can invest in infrastructure, so they can invest in capital, so they can kind of grow their economies, build things that will facilitate economic growth over the long term. And then the other part is the International Development Association, or IDA, and that one provides interest-free loans, which are called credits, and grants to governments of the world's poorest countries. So those are the non-credit-worthy countries. These are the countries that you would think of as the world's poorest countries, the really developing countries where conditions are very bad. They give them interest-free money to help those countries develop. And so the World Bank's goals, it has a series of goals, and it continues to set new goals, but there's goals related to reducing global poverty, eliminating global poverty even, and the way it does that is by investing in the world's poorest countries, kind of with no strings attached is the idea. In reality, there are sometimes strings attached. And by helping the kind of middle countries continue their economic growth so they don't fall back into poverty. And in that way, the World Bank is sort of like the world's lending institution. It's like where the world goes to get a loan, whereas the IMF is slightly different. The IMF is sort of like the payday loan service, whereas the World Bank is where you would go to kind of get like a college scholarship, or where you would get a grant an entrepreneurship grant or something like that to build a business. Number 5, and the last one I'll talk about, is the G20 and the G8. Those are separate things. These are all both referred to kind of as clubs or clubs of clubs. The G20, or Group of 20, is an international forum for governments and central bank governors from 20 of the world's major economies. You can look up the members. It's Argentina, Australia, Brazil, Canada, China, France, Germany, India, Indonesia, Italy, Japan, South Korea, Mexico, Russia, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, Turkey, the UK, and the US, and then the EU is also represented by the European Commission. So it's like what you would think of. There are a few ones that maybe are a little bit weird, but basically the biggest countries in the world, those members account for 85% of the world's GDP and about 2/3 of the world's population, so very big. And it's a meta-organization where it doesn't really oversee all of the world's financial institutions, so it doesn't really oversee the IMF and World Bank and WTO, but it sort of is like that. It's where the really rich countries, kind of the world's leading countries, get together and they talk about, all right, what policies do we need? What changes do we need to make? What are potential problems going forward for the world's economy and for world security? And then the member nations within the other international institutions pursue those agendas. So the rich countries might agree, we need to really get back on negotiating the Doha round. We really got to take care of the agriculture issue. Let's make a commitment to that. And then within the WTO process, the G20 countries kind of together would push that agenda. That's kind of the idea.
Wait, so they're like getting together to agree this is what we're all going to do?
In principle, yes.
Right, and then they like kind of force it upon the other countries?
That's the idea. Well, not force it, but because they are so powerful together, if they're all on the same page, that's what happens.
Okay.
They meet once a year, or more if necessary. And in 2008, they replaced the G8 as the world's primary economic council of wealthy nations. But the G8 still exists. It's now the G7 because Russia is temporarily kicked out until 2017, at least, because it invaded Ukraine. And that includes Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, and the US. And again, the EU is also there, but they don't get in the name. And that also usually meets once a year. The G8 now is almost entirely focused on international security stuff. So Ukraine, Syria, Libya, stuff like that, the refugee crisis. Those are the kind of things that get talked about in the G8. So far, the G8 countries have been unwilling to extend that discussion to include China and Brazil and the other countries. They're still keeping that for themselves. A lot of times they still do talk about economic growth, though. They talk about crises, global security, energy, terrorism, stuff like that. Obviously, as you will notice, several countries are on both of these lists. The United States and the UK and Japan and Germany and Italy and Canada and France. And so those are really the countries that, in effect, rule the world in these clubs of clubs. And these clubs of clubs are sort of above the multilateral institutions, but they are definitely part of the liberal international order. And so each of these serves a different function, but together, kind of the whole set of these institutions is the system by which the United States designed and then encouraged the creation of and kind of manipulated the outcomes of to create a structure that overcomes the anarchy of the international system. And that's not to say that it always works, but the idea is that this whole set of open, rule-based institutions will create incentives for mutual cooperation on a wide variety of issues and will prevent nations from engaging in conflict, whether that's trade conflict or actual armed conflict, because the incentives for cooperation are so high and because there is a pathway for them to become involved in the governance of these institutions. So last Roman numeral is why this is an important part of the China topic. And the first important question is whether this liberal international system or liberal international order is now in crisis. And most authors, many authors would say yes, although they differ a lot about the causes or consequences of that liberal international crisis. Some authors say that it is not in crisis. So Ikenberry's argument is that, quote, yes, the American liberal hegemonic order is in crisis, but it is a crisis of authority within the liberal international order and not a crisis of its underlying principles and organizational logic. That is, it is a crisis of the American governance of liberal order and not of liberal order itself. the crisis of liberalism today will ultimately bring forth more liberalism. And what he means by that is that the grievance that other countries have is not that there is a WTO, or that there is an IMF, or that there is a World Bank, or that there is a G20. It is that they do not have an adequate voice within those institutions. And so Ikenberry's argument is that other countries generally like this arrangement, this idea that there is an open, rule-based set of institutions that aid countries in achieving cooperative outcomes, that kind of create a stable expectation for international behavior, that create norms that most countries follow. Countries like Brazil and Russia and India and China, the BRIC countries, generally like that, but they just disagree that the United States should get to lead that liberal international system, that the United States should have undue influence in the UN, in the IMF, in the WTO, in the World Bank, etc. So he says, I argue that the post-Cold War liberal international order is more durable than many think. Russia and China are not its inevitable enemies. A grand alternative does not exist. To put it sharply, the pathway to the future still runs through institutions and relationships created over the last 60 years. American unipolarity will no doubt eventually give way to something new. Power and authority will shift in the global system as they have over the centuries, but rival orders will not emerge, even if new leaders will. In the decades ahead, the United States and Europe and rising states, many of which are in Asia, will have more reasons and not fewer reasons to cooperate in open and rule-based ways. So that's one side of the argument. The other side of the argument is expressed by many people. Here, an example is from Peter Boyle, who's a LaSalle University professor and a Foreign Policy Research Institute, FPRI person. He says the coming illiberal order will not replicate the dog-eat-dog character of European great power politics prior to 1914, nor will it lead to the complete dismantling of all the structures that the U.S. has supported since 1945. Very few people think that that would actually happen, and we could really undo these 75 years of construction of institutions. And so he says prescriptions based on that are wrong. But whether Washington likes it or not, the character of the new illiberal order will be very different from what has come before. The new international order will be marked by the ascendancy of illiberal states and their value systems and a corresponding diminishment of the political and economic influence of the United States. The character of the rising states will gradually transform both the institutions and the normative underpinnings of the liberal order through two processes. First, in the new illiberal order, the institutions of the previous order, such as the UN, WTO, etc., will remain intact, but their structures and policies will be retrofitted to suit the interests of newly dominant illiberal states. To complement this process, these states will build a parallel set of institutions whose purpose will be to sideline the US and build leverage in the developing world. Second, the key concepts of the liberal order, such as self-determination, self-defense, democracy promotion, and the respect to protect, among others, will be contested or reimagined by illiberal states with different interests. This process of institutional change and normative contestation can already be seen in the degree to which illiberal states have articulated a new selective interpretation of the principle of non-intervention in places such as Libya, Ukraine, and Syria. For the United States, adapting to the new illiberal order will require abandoning its assumption of exceptional status and rethinking what it means to be the leading liberal state in a world where that position guarantees much less than it used to. So is there a crisis of liberal internationalism, of the liberal international order? Yes, no. What is the cause of that? What are the consequences of that? The second major question is just whether that crisis is good or bad. And that's a question with multiple answers, but that's an essential component of the hegemony good, hegemony bad, impact turn debate that we all participate in debates. A big part of the pro-hegemony side of that debate is that the United States' global leadership is essential to maintain the integrity of the liberal international system that the United States built. So in other words, without the United States, kind of contrary to Ikenberry, those liberal international institutions will no longer serve the interests of liberal peace. They will no longer contribute to economic openness, to cooperation rather than conflict, etc. The hedge bad people might suggest that the liberal international order is bad. Certainly the part of the liberal international system that is based on the Washington Consensus about how to transition a developing country into a developed country has a lot of critics. The neoliberalism bad critique certainly links to the IMF and perhaps to the World Bank. So there's a good debate about is it good or bad for this system that the United States has created to either collapse, although that's unlikely, but really the impact debate is about is it good for the United States to maintain it kind of as it is and to continue playing a leading role in it, or would it be better if that system was changed, likely by the rise of China and the other BRIC countries? Would that eventual outcome be better? That's a great back and forth debate that you'll debate a lot. The asks about the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the asks about the TPP and China's role in it, those all involve this larger discussion of who should control the global economic system and the global political system. Should it be the United States-led liberal international system, or should it be something else? Number three is the question of whether China is a status quo power, or a revisionist power. And that's an essential question on the topic. A status quo power aims at maintaining the existing distribution of power as it exists at a particular time, and they are opposed to any disruption of the power relationship in the international system because the power distribution in the international system benefits them. Revisionist countries or challenging countries want a new international system. They want a new distribution of power within the international system, one or the other, and they express general dissatisfaction with the way things are in the status quo. There is a back and forth about whether China is a status quo power or a revisionist power. On one side, the argument is that China is dissatisfied with the liberal international system that the United States has created. Within the China is a revisionist power camp, there are kind of two theories. One theory is that China wants to totally upend the liberal international system. They want to replace the liberal international system that the United States created with their own China-led international system, or they're just opposed to the idea of an international system altogether, and they would like to pursue their own agenda and their own power to expand their sphere of influence, regardless of the institutions and the norms that have been set by previous great powers, in this case the United States. The kind of more moderate version of that, and the one that is much more common, is that China is opposed to the status quo, but really their opposition is not to the existence of the liberal international order, but it's to their power within that liberal international order. And so the thing they want to revise is not the existence of these institutions, but instead their role within it and the distribution of power within it, even maybe beyond their country themselves. They want developing countries to have more access and more control. They want authoritarian governments like Russia to have more control. They want Chinese influence in the UN and in the WTO and in the IMF and in the World Bank, and they want China to be making decisions about how to issue global loans or about how to do development in the third world. They want China to kind of have control over that apparatus of international government that has been created by the United States. On the other side are those who think that China is a status quo power, and the argument there is that China is basically happy with the international system as it has been developed because it has enabled them to rise. It has created a space for them to grow their economy. It has created a set of norms that will allow them to avoid great power conflict with the United States. There's a huge debate in the IR literature about whether it is necessary and just sort of inevitable that when a rising power rises and a great power is challenged, that those two countries go to war. So is it inevitable that because China is rising and the United States is the current hegemon, is that conflict between those two countries inevitable? Some people think that yes, it is. Often realists think that, although not all realists think that. Some people think that it is not inevitable, and maybe the reason that it is not inevitable in 2016, whereas it maybe been inevitable before, is because China's rise is occurring within the context of this liberal international order that is kind of moderating Chinese behavior. It is creating expectations for how a country can gain power without fighting a war. So as China's economy grows, as it becomes more diplomatically active, as it gains soft power and credibility internationally, as it does more integration with these systems, it will naturally get more power, which is the goal of a rising power. And so that theory is that the liberal international system will actually become an instrument of China's rise, and the outcome of China's rise within the system will be a peaceful transition from a US-led liberal international system to a system that is still a liberal international system, but where the United States has slightly less power and China has slightly more. The back and forth about that is fascinating, and there are a lot of authors on both sides of that discussion that we will certainly delve into as the course of the year develops. But a fundamental question that you need to be able to ask yourself, and that you need to understand kind of all of what I've been talking about in order to answer, is what is China's goal? Do they want to get rid of the UN and the WTO and the IMF and the World Bank and the G20, although they're in the G20, so I guess the G8 or G7, or do they just want a greater role within that? And that will shape a lot of your impact turn debates, your impact defense debates, your links to China containment, China rise DAs. All of that is kind of structured by that fundamental question. And we could have an entire lecture about that, many lectures about that. But being able to understand what that system is that China might be competing against or to participate in is essential, and I think a lot of people are missing that. Fourth, and the last one, is will China and the BRICS more generally, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, create alternatives, effective alternatives to the liberal international institutions that the United States has created. So there are many competitive or competing institutions that are either already exist or ideas for them have already existed. The New Development Bank, the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the BRICS Development Bank, the Silk Road Initiative, the Asian Bond Markets Initiative, the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, and the list goes on and on. And within each of those is a debate about what effect this new institution will have on the existing liberal international order. In some cases, it will offer sort of a supplement, an improvement to the existing liberal international system, but this new organization or bank or investment group or whatever will just become a new part of the existing system. It doesn't really challenge the fundamental reality or the fundamental norms of the system. It's just another venue within the international system that kind of shares a general overarching framework. Or will it clash with that system and jeopardize the integrity of that system or the credibility of that system? So in some ways, the creation, and in some people's opinions, the creation of these alternative institutions in which China and Brazil and Russia, et cetera, have greater influence may be good for the liberal international system because it's a way to create more multilateral forums that encourage cooperation that can make China and Russia and Brazil happy about their relative status in the world community, their relative power within global politics, without forcing them to engage in conflict or to kind of overturn all that came before, without rejecting the idea of a single, open, rule-based community. And on the other hand, these institutions might result in blocks or fractures within the international system. They result in different groups with different spheres of influence. So there's the Asian-led international order led by China, and then there's the Western-led international order where the United States and Europe mostly cooperate. And between those two sets of blocks, there will be less cooperation, there will be less trade, there will be less relationship building. And that could be good or bad, but from the perspective of those who defend the liberal international order, that could pose an existential challenge to it, because if an alternative structure is created and more developing countries start to move that way, some more developed countries might have to, for economic reasons, kind of re-architect their trading relationships, their alliance relationships. Maybe Japan's got to join the China-led version of the Asian IMF, the Asian World Bank. And so as a result, the United States' relative power declines, the power of the Western liberal system declines, and maybe that results in conflict, maybe that results in changes in the global order that are bad. On the other hand, maybe that's good, maybe that's what we should want, maybe the US-led system isn't that great. And all of this debate is now taking place in the follow-up to the financial collapse in 2008 and the Great Recession. And so there's another huge debate about what that financial collapse means for these alternative institutions and for the dominant institutions that we have discussed. Did the WTO succeed in the post-2008 era? Did the IMF, did the World Bank, did the UN, did the system work? Drezner says it did. Many people say it didn't. Others have, maybe this part of the system worked and this part of the system didn't work. But an important question is, if not the liberal international order, what? And conversely, what do new developments from China mean for the liberal international order? So is it in crisis? Is that crisis good or bad? And kind of what caused that crisis? Is China a status quo power or a revisionist power? And what alternative institutions are going to be created by China, and what effect will those have on the liberal international system and the good and bad parts of it? So summarizing the whole thing, the liberal international order is a set of open, rule-based institutions that attempt to support multilateral cooperation between countries. A big facet of it is economic, but it's also political. The United States has led the creation of it over the last 70 years. And in 2016, we are at a moment in history where a huge debate is occurring among policymakers and the academic community about the future of that liberal international order. Is it going to survive? Is the United States' decline, inevitable decline? Is China's rise inevitable? And is the inevitable outcome of that the demise of this liberal international order that we have all taken for granted, that has existed for our entire lives and shaped our understanding of international politics? And would that be a good or bad outcome? So a big part of this year's debate is all about this liberal international order, and hopefully now you have the ability to debate this with a little bit more intelligence and background than you did before. When I'm done, I'm going to turn off my camera, and then we can ask questions.